Trump has made no secret of his plans should he end up back in the White House after the 2024 election. End criminal investigations into his actions before, during, and after the 2020 election, and use federal resources to investigate and prosecute his political enemies. But as The Atlantic's Barton Gellman writes in How Trump Gets Away with It, the important question is how much of that agenda he could actually carry out in a second term. And the answer is apparently a lot. When it comes to those criminal investigations of either himself or his political enemies, only tradition, not binding law, prevents the president and his political appointees from issuing orders to the FBI about its investigations. There is little to stop Trump from firing special counsel Jack Smith. He may be removed for misconduct, dereliction of duty, incapacity, conflict of interest, or for other good cause. No law would prevent Trump from ordering that the charges against him be dropped. He could do so even with a trial in progress, right up to the moment before a jury returned a verdict. Trump will be able to avoid going to prison even if he has already been convicted of federal charges before he is sworn in. A trial judge is unlikely to order Trump imprisoned even after sentencing before he exhausts his appeals. And there is no plausible scenario in which that happens before Inauguration Day. At any time while Trump's appeals are pending, his Justice Department may notify the appellate court that the prosecution no longer wishes to support his conviction. The effect, if the court grants the request, is to vacate a conviction. So that's what he'd like to do and how he'd go about it. But then the question is, who exactly will do Donald Trump's bidding so that he can get all of that done? Barton Gellman has a few ideas about that as well. He joins me now. Barton Gellman, staff writer at The Atlantic and senior fellow at the Century Foundation, author of the most terrifying pieces about the what ifs I have ever read. This one is no exception. Barton, you have talked about in the piece the way in which Trump may be able to get some of the most, and this is euphemistic, unsavory characters in Trump land into the highest offices, cabinet level positions, because there's an interesting kind of workaround in federal law. Can you talk a little bit about how you would manage to get someone like, Stephen Miller named Secretary of Homeland Security?
So you have to start off by thinking, who could be confirmed by the Senate?
Right.
And of course, it depends who controls the Senate. But someone like Stephen Miller is sufficiently controversial. Maybe he would have trouble even in a Republican Senate. Mm-hmm. But that's not the end of the question, because then there's the Vacancies Reform Act, which allows Trump, who loves acting appointments, to appoint someone, Secretary of Homeland Security or Attorney General, on an acting basis.
Just a temporary fill-in forever.
Just a temporary fill-in for, if it's at the beginning of the administration, it's 300 some days. If it's later in the administration, it's 200 some days, but they can be re-upped. And in order to appoint someone, in order to be qualified as an acting, that person has to either already be sitting in a Senate-confirmed position, and all the people who are Senate-confirmed will be the people who are serving under Biden.
Right. So unlikely that he's going to use any of those folks.
Except there's another little loophole here. There are probably about 100 Republicans who are in Senate-confirmed positions under Joe Biden, because there are all these boards, like the National Labor Relations Board,
right,
that are required by law to be balanced by party. There have to be Democrats and Republicans.
So there's some Republicans scattered about the Biden administration, but one would assume that they are not going to be sufficiently conservative for Donald Trump's purposes.
Trump's people are looking. Do they have some MAGA people undercover already in the U.S. government? If not, they have to find someone who is at least a GS-15 on the federal pay scale, who is in the department.
So relatively senior, for those not familiar with what GS-15 connotes. You have to be a relatively senior administration official, and then you can occupy the position for 90 days. Is that right?
You have to have been in that.
Sorry, you have to have been in that position for 90 days, and then you can be enacting
for most of a year. Yeah.
But so that's the workaround. You hire someone like Stephen Miller to work in a senior position for 90 days, and then he qualifies to be someone Trump can name as acting, Attorney General, Secretary of Homeland Security. That is the workaround.
Yes.
that is, I think, for people who have long thought Kash Patel will never be the director of the CIA, he'd never get past the Senate, a very compelling and, just many eyes, I think, terrifying realization that there is, in fact, a workaround for something like that. Can you talk a little bit about, this piece is so exhaustive and well-researched, Barton, the ways in which Trump could avoid jail time, potentially, if convicted of federal crimes before Election Day? What exactly he would have to do to avoid that?
So, as you said very correctly, right up until the moment the jury delivers its verdict, the Justice Department could simply drop the case.
Right.
They could say, we interrupt these deliberations. You don't have to decide whether he's guilty. We're dropping the charge. If he's already convicted, then the Justice Department makes what's called a confession of error and says, we've changed our mind. We are not going to oppose his appeal. We believe the charge, the conviction should be vacated. Nothing stops the Justice Department from doing that. And that's certainly what would happen if Trump were
effectively running the Justice Department, as he
right.
says he basically would be.
Right. So that's a certainty. The harder question, because like so many other things in the Trump world, it has never been resolved or litigated, is what would happen to state charges.
Yes.
Right. So suppose he's in the middle of trial on the Georgia case, or even has been convicted. The Justice Department will go to federal court and argue that it is unconstitutional for a lesser sovereign, the state of Georgia, Fani Willis, to attempt to imprison the chief executive of the United States, because that would prevent the chief executive from doing his constitutionally required duties. And almost certainly,
the Supreme Court.
The court would say this has to go on pause until the end of the presidency. So that takes you to 2029.
And indeed, Judge McAfee down in Georgia was asked when feasibly would be a good time to start this trial with Donald Trump. And they said, after he finishes out his second term in the year 2029. Barton Gellman, I think a lot of Democrats hope that the Trump team does not read this piece, because there are a lot of directions and information about how to skirt the guardrails of democracy. It is compelling and terrifying. Thank you for joining me tonight.
Thanks for having me.
Appreciate it.